not like I need to turn this into a business or I need to get this out there before somebody else has the same idea. Because for me personally, that is like a bit of a psychological trap.
How is it a psychological trap?
I think that building some successful app, innovative app where I'm learning a whole bunch of things along the way will bring me happiness, everlasting happiness, basically. Which of course it never does, and it comes at the expense of other parts of your life, like your family life and your social life, and just it takes up real estate in my brain.
Today I'm speaking with Matt Neary. Matt is a Bubble.io educator. He runs a popular YouTube channel where he posts free tutorials, and he also offers a course for those looking to master the Bubble platform at thinkitbuildit.com. All of those links are in the description to this video. One of the things I really love about how Matt approaches education is how he incorporates storytelling into his lessons. He has a background in film, and as you'll see from our conversation, he almost seems to approach teaching and even product development from the perspective of a filmmaker or storyteller. So he's focused on leading his students or product users through a narrative and on revealing the right information at just the right time. We spend a lot of time talking about education and the best ways to learn Bubble. We spend some time hypothesizing about how AI is going to impact education, and we even get into the topic of fatherhood. Matt is a new father, and I wanted to pick his brain and understand how that has changed his life so far. So anyways, we talk about a whole bunch. Matt is just an all-around great dude, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I think you will too. If you are enjoying these conversations, make sure to like this video and to subscribe to the channel. You're listening to User Stories, episode number 14 with Matt Neary. On Think It, Build It, which is the website that you use to sell your course, you have a what you'll learn section. And step 3 of that section is that if I, as someone who wants to learn Bubble and no code, if I take your course, I'm going to learn how to think like a programmer. So my first question is, first of all, what does it mean to think like a programmer? And why is that important? I thought this was supposed to be no code. Why do I need to think like a programmer?
Yeah, right. Firstly, yeah, pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me, Jacob. So I guess the programming part is my attempt at describing the sort of the abstract thinking mindset that somebody has that's different from just the tool of Bubble. So I think I spent a lot of time in my early Bubble, I would say years, not really having an explicit programming mindset, but just knowing kind of like how to use the tool. And, you know, I could refer to a result of step 1 and blah, 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 things like that. But I didn't necessarily I didn't have principles. I didn't have like a framework for thinking about how I would string certain pieces of logic together. So, and I think that is like really, really critical, not to make it more complicated, because in some sense it's just like, you know, if you're just starting out, it's like, yeah, why do I want to have to think about programming? Like, just let me use this tool and let me build my app. But as I'm sure like all of us who have been in the Bubble world have encountered, like we get ourselves into rabbit holes, we get ourselves into spaghetti code bundles that could be avoided if we had taken a more programming mindset from the beginning. So like, and this is something that I've just like inherited over the course of like building obviously like many apps and seeing apps built by different people, like talking to developers who are a lot better than me, and outside of the programming world as well. But, you know, just as an example, like the dry principle is like one that I like talk about quite often, because I think it encapsulates like so much of having this like pre-existing mindset of the way that you're programming. So dry, do not repeat yourself, you know, storing data, storing values in one place that you can kind of reference. And that's very tightly related to other concepts like decoupling and all this kind of stuff that is like more established in the wider programming world. But I feel like the conversation in the Bubble sphere hasn't really matured to that point. Yeah, it's not super mainstream. A lot of agencies have their own ways of working that I think use a lot of these concepts implicitly. And I picked up them at most of it at AirDev when I was working there. But yeah, so I think that's where beginners struggle quite a lot is if they don't have this mindset, then they can just they can go into sort of different quagmires. And I am trying to impart this idea of like developing a programming mindset as part of the value of the course.
So if you had to kind of, I think what I hear you saying, if you had to like sum up what thinking like a programmer is, I mean, it seems like it's a whole bunch of different things, but little rules that you pick up over time that help you to write more efficient programming, if that makes any sense. I mean, I think one of the things that hit me when I was learning Bubble and then started to venture into the world of code a little bit is that I think once you start learning a tool like Bubble, you don't really realize it, but you are starting to think programmatically. Just the way that the tool is designed. I used to say to my students that like, I think one of the things that they do most brilliantly, like their real innovation is like fooling people into thinking that you're not programming or writing code. You really are, but you're just doing it in their own visual way that they've created.
Yeah, I think that definitely there's a big element of that. Like what, stringing together different actions where you can like refer to the result of another one is like built in dry, right? But yeah, there's still a lot of, it's still pretty open-ended. Like it doesn't really push you into developing in a particular way. But yeah, as you said, like there are lots of little, just the way that the whole system is integrated, obviously like pulling out values from a database that's just like living right there, and being able to store stuff in custom states that's obviously their version of variables. It pushes you in a direction, but I still think that it's still so open-ended that like there's many more, I guess like design patterns that one could implement that once you're putting professional level apps are just kind of like critical.
So let's zoom in on that beginner user. On a previous episode, I was speaking with Nick, who works on the Bubble product team. He's a product manager there, and he asked me what I thought the Bubble learning curve was, and it kind of caught me off guard because it was tough to kind of like boil that down in terms of what does a complete beginner need to do in order to master this massive tool like Bubble. If you had to answer that question, let's say if you had to break it down into 3 to 5 things that someone needs to do in order to master Bubble, and you can approach this question in whatever way you want. It can be features that they need to learn. It can be concepts, however you want to approach it. What would those 3 to 5 things be in your mind that someone needs to master in order to be a proficient bubbler?
Interesting. Yeah, I guess so. I'd answer that question, but I would add a disclaimer that like, I think it would be very bad to try to learn Bubble by like focusing on these 5 things,
Sure.
as opposed to just like, hey, I want to build this like food planner app. Let's just like try and see if I can make it work. And that being like the thread that you're tugging on. And then maybe you kind of revisit some more abstract concepts along the way, but it's more, you've got a sort of like a practical foundation. Yeah, so I mean, I think the first one is just like the idea of input and output. I think that's something that, I don't know if it's something that I kind of learned along the way, or if it's just now helpful to think about that in retrospect. But I think something that stood out to me, in not just in Bubble, but like, as you start to like push around the edges, is just like everything is just input and output. Like at the end of the day, like if you're importing like a JavaScript library and it's giving you some functions, like functions take certain inputs, give you certain outputs, so that you're just stringing together a whole bunch of black boxes at the end of the day, no matter what you're doing. And making sure that you're understanding what the input is and what type of thing it is, like what shape it is. Like in the course, like this way, like I'm like drawing shapes, like triangles and like squares, and like try to impart that sense of like the input is a triangle, like, and if you're trying, and the output is a square, and if you're trying to input a square into a custom event or whatever it is that is expecting a circle, then it's not going to work, right? So just I think input and output, just thinking about like an application is just a big series of a complex web of inputs and outputs, you could say. Um, and
That's helpful
I guess
for debugging too. Sorry to interrupt. I was thinking like, you know, even after all these years of being on Bubble, when something's not working as I would expect it, when the program that I'm building, the app that I'm building, is producing a different output than I would expect, there's a part of me that is still like, oh, well, everything must be broken. But like almost all, and in very rare cases, maybe sometimes it actually is a bug with Bubble or something like that. But almost always, if I go back and start debugging, there is something wrong with the input that I am giving this program. It's maybe an expression is wrong, or a certain constraint on a search is wrong, whatever it is. There's something broken with the input. So I think it's like a helpful thing to keep in mind with debugging. For some reason, that example came to mind, because debugging can be a very emotional thing too when things are just broken.
Oh man, yeah. I still, it's still kind of like my arch enemy is just like getting really frustrated with a bug and going against the advice, which like I know is true, which is just like to take a break and step
Mm-hmm.
away, but I'll just like keep shoving and shoving and shoving and shoving. And then lo and behold, like when I have to take a break out of like sheer necessity, because I'm about to like keel over in front of my keyboard, then of course, you're like, then you start to think about it actually in terms of like, yeah, what is the input actually and what is the output, and all you can ever do is basically, right, is check what's the output at this stage of the program. Like that's all you can ever really do when you're debugging something.
Yeah, nicely said. That happened to me this weekend too. Friday, I had this one problem that I was trying to figure out, was banging my head against the wall, really didn't want to go into the weekend without having this one thing solved. Couldn't figure it out in time. Came back on Monday and figured it out in like 2 seconds. It was just some stupid
Yeah.
expression that I had wrong. But I interrupted you. So, okay, input and output, number one. Keep going with that. I like
Yeah,
that.
and I really, this is probably a bit of an abstract level. I would say beyond that, I think thinking about the program that you're building, or the product that you're building, and what features it really. Well, this is more of like a product than a developer question, I think, but it's something that I see all the time. It's just like, yeah, getting carried away with building features for the sake of features. I think just being able to like encapsulate what you're building in a like a self-contained thing, and then like shipping that or testing that or whatever, but just like rather than thinking about the whole app, this is maybe the right way to say it, is rather than thinking about the whole app as just like this um amorphous thing that just like keeps growing limbs, like try to sort of define the edges of it and just like build up to those edges, um and just yeah, build what you need to, and build things in like a modular or self-contained way that you can just keep adding new Lego blocks, so to speak, onto.
Okay, so let's we'll I guess the way this is working out right now is we'll keep going down that path, and I want to venture off that branch right now. We'll fork a new branch, and I want to ask you a question about that. So, I mean, you teach a lot of beginners who are coming in, and I imagine a lot of them find your work, find Bubble because, it's a classic story. Like, I have an idea for a startup. I don't want to hire developers or raise money to build it with code. So I'm going to learn how to build it myself. So what you were just talking about, I think, is like one of the big challenges that I've seen and that I've struggled with myself, but that I've seen a lot of people who are just learning Bubble make, which is I have this idea for an app. I want to just build it, and once you start building it, of course, you keep on adding features without incorporating your user into that feedback process. Now, for you, as an educator whose job it is to teach someone the platform, how do you balance those two? Like, if someone wants to build a feature, you can teach them how to do it, but are there times where you find yourself stepping in more as almost like a business advisor, saying like, hey, instead of building this out, maybe you should talk to your users and see if that's something that they actually need. Or I guess how do you balance those two to help your students not go overboard with just building unnecessary features, which I'm sure all of us have done in the past at some point?
Yeah, well, I mean, the times where I've done like more one-on-one coaching, consulting over the years, like I'm always putting that like product hat on. I feel like even if I was building a product and I had a mentor, they would probably be giving me that advice too, because sometimes it's just like hard to see the context that you're operating in when you're just like in the app or in whatever space that you're in. So I think like all the time is the short answer in those situations. But like in the context of like a tutorial video, not like I'm not having that conversation, or just helping somebody learn Bubble, like in the context of learning the skill set. Like yeah, not having that conversation really.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting how different formats of teaching lend themselves differently to that. I used to do a lot of like live boot camps, and that seems to be a space where you can have those conversations more, where it feels more appropriate. But I think you're right. Okay, so number one, input output. Number two, this idea of like don't go overboard building just a whole bunch of unnecessary features, and really try to do some work to hone in on what the product is that you're building. Number three.
Yeah, I guess number three would be a design related piece, and not just the mechanics of like how does the responsive engine work, but and this is kind of closely related to the second point really, is getting comfortable with design principles, both like user interface design principles and just user experience design principles, which I don't necessarily think has to be that complicated. Like it's not like, I mean, I've never really gone out there and like read a UX book and like learned all these like, you know, tidbit principles and things. It's more just like keeping things really simple and streamlined, and and then, you know, that combined with a you know, a user interface principle perspective, which is also about keeping things simple and just displaying the right information, and then just stuff, you know, all the mechanical stuff under that, like spacing and keeping things aligned, and like how to draw attention with typography and color, and like it doesn't have to be complicated. Like I think it's a pretty simple thing. It's a pretty simple stuff to learn. Doesn't mean you have to like go out there and create like amazing designs on Dribble, but it's just like, I think there's a big difference between not having those principles in mind and having them in mind. Like you can just go out there and build an app and it can just look like a rainbow themed garbage pit in terms of the mess and the colors. But if you just have certain principles in mind, then it could be like the orderly office, you know, where you discard your paper rubbish or something. I don't know.
And how do you approach that topic in your course as someone who's not, you know, who doesn't have like a like background in UI, UX design, at least not like professionally trained, let's say? What core principles do you focus on when teaching design?
So, I mean, very like tactically, there is like a lesson on that, and I think there's 5, and it's like keeping things aligned, use color sparingly, use appropriate amount of white space, like not having things be super crowded, keeping related information together, you know, like a label and an input, and like have the space between those be greater than the space within them, and I think using typography as well appropriately, like weights and a size to like indicate hierarchy. Because I think a lot of this is just about like leading the user through an experience. Like I come from a video production, like film background, not professionally, more just like an ongoing hobby and an attempt to break into that world when I was younger. And to be frank, like I've always sort of thought about apps in a similar way. Like you're kind of telling a story, like you're just revealing the right information at the right time. And how you can display that information and how you can lead the user is just, it's underlined by some of these principles of, that's sort of mechanically speaking how you might lay things out on the page. But they're not app or app development exclusive principles. Like they're just design principles in general. Like there's a design course that I took years ago on Udemy, which is like, that was all I took, and that's basically like formed this like foundation, and it just like made a 10 times improvement, I think, in my ability to like create interfaces. And you can see them like in the course, I'm like using like a newspaper to like show these principles, because it's agnostic to the medium, and that's what this course creator stressed as well. Like these are like timeless design principles. Like you look over the last like 100 years at like print advertising, for example, and like you see these principles over and over again. So there's obviously some stuff that's probably, there's some nuance with app development, but like overall, that they're not complicated principles, and once you see them, then you can't really unsee them.
Yeah. No, and I like that way. I like that it is that simple, where it's more just like there are some basic principles that you need to stick to. It's helpful for someone like me who's hopelessly bad at making things look beautiful, like making my room look pretty or something like that. It's helpful to know that like if you just follow these fundamental things, your app won't look terrible. It's also fascinating to hear your comparison there between your background in film and how you think about storytelling. I want to talk about storytelling in a little bit here, but that related to UI UX design. One of the things I was thinking about as you were speaking, one of the things that I learned from speaking with and working with a professional UI UX designer is he told me that the thing that people screw up the most is just consistency. So there's like a million different ways to make things look nice, but once you pick one, just sticking with that. And if you think about that in terms of storytelling too, when people break consistency, when they're using one font on one page and another font on another page, or when they're not being consistent with those typography rules that you spoke about, it kind of interrupts that narrative that the user is going down, this story that the user is going down, in a way that doesn't feel great as a user. And I think as a user too, you may not even notice. I think it's hard to notice sometimes like why an app feels weird when you're on it. Like you almost can't articulate it, but it's most likely, I think, those little things, those little inconsistencies that keep popping up that just make you feel like the app you're on is not designed well in some weird way.
Yeah, I think that's like 100% correct, and an apt way of summarizing all of this, really. Like there's an infinite amount of directions that you can go in. But yeah, we're creating tools that are like, it's not like a piece of art where you could experiment and break convention. Like it's a tool. It's got like a functional requirement. You don't want to confuse people. You want to give them more or less what they're familiar with from using other applications. And and that is like a consistent experience, a consistent UI. I don't know if you've experienced this. This is only something I realized recently, but like, I still don't think I'm very good at this, but I think I'm much better at coordinating my own wardrobe. And that is from learning some of these principles, like about like color and that kind of thing. We've got like an 8-month-old at home, and I still bring him downstairs sometimes, and my partner is like, what the hell have you dressed him in? But I feel like I'm getting better, like I'm trying to coordinate, and I've actually got like that idea from app development, weirdly.
So is that like, if I had to guess, not clashing too many colors, keeping things just simple, and it's
and not mixing patterns, as well. That's a
right.
hard one, because a lot of kids' clothing has like, patterns on it, elephants.
Right. And like huge logos and stuff like that. I guess maybe just being careful about how you're using like space on clothing and on your app.
Yeah. Maybe you could summarize it as attention, like to be careful how you're directing attention. Yeah. Because we can't multitask. We can't see multiple things at once. It's like when somebody has a PowerPoint and it's like images and text and they're speaking. It still happens, but like it's one of the number one rules, right? As soon as somebody tries to teach you how to do better slides, is like just have really simple slides and talk, but don't have stuff on both because people just get distracted. It's the same underlying principle.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so number 1, we said input output. Number 2, we said just not building a whole bunch of features, and I guess getting clear on what it is that you're building, who it's for. And number 3, UI UX design. I said originally in my question that in 3 to 5, pick 3 to 5 things that would allow someone to come in as a complete beginner to Bubble and master it. So you're going down these concepts and presenting them. You have room for 2 more. What do you think?
Room for 2 more. Well, so if you're talking about like how to become like very proficient at Bubble, and by the way, like I don't know, there's other people out there who have a very different perspective, who are much better developers than me. But I would just say, like, to get to like a level where you're building professional level apps for clients and feeling like comfortable with that. I've just lost one of them. Yeah. So I think one is the fourth one, let's say, is maybe learning it, is getting more comfortable with like how Bubble fits within the wider like web technology framework. And there's obviously like a million things to learn there, but something that I didn't learn for a long time was just like client versus server and the differences between them. And I think those kind of mental models just are, well, one is essential from like a security and performance point of view, but also just like Bubble stops being just like this magical thing out there on its own, and like you can see how it fits into like the wider web world, and how you might extend it and get it to talk to other services and stuff like that.
It's an interesting one for me too, because I agree with you. And for me, when I was learning this stuff, once those models clicked in my mind, let's say like once I kind of understood how the traditional web development works and how Bubble fits into that landscape, it was huge for me. At the same time, how do you at what point do you think someone who's just learning this stuff should grapple with that and should try to understand that? Like, is it something that you would introduce on like, in the first week? I guess, where does it fit into the curriculum in your mind?
I mean, probably at the halfway point or beyond. I don't even know if we've defined what the end point would be, but no, definitely not at the beginning. Like in the beginning, it's just about getting a feel for what programming feels like, and Bubble is obviously like the medium through which you do that, and you're learning new features and that kind of thing, and sort of developing a model in your mind about how you should go about building certain features and stuff like that. And I don't think you need to introduce that other stuff until you have a practical use for it, frankly. Like
back-end workflows or something. Once you get to that point, it's maybe helpful to think about client servers, right?
Right, exactly. But back-end workflows or APIs, or even even just like some performance stuff, like trying to like prefetch some records and store them on the page, or I always think like you don't want to learn anything. I think it's this just-in-time learning is the concept. You don't want to learn anything until you have a practical application for it, because otherwise you don't remember it. So that's something that I try to do in my whatever I'm teaching, is try to like use the practical project as a vehicle for introducing concepts. And yeah.
Okay. And last, did you remember the other one that you'd forgot briefly?
Well, this one I just mentioned was the one I forgot. So the other one, like, I just think Bubble has like all kinds of weird idiosyncrasies that that's probably like the stuff that you got to learn. Like, what is a client side action and what is a server side action? um, yeah, there's like the bubble way of doing things that and yeah, how another example is, like when you run a workflow, like what actions fire at what time. Like, oh, you got to use a custom event to like force sequentialize, sequentialized piece of logic. All this kind of just like weird stuff. That you just if you're doing bubble for a period of time, you kind of just pick up. But if you had to like write it all down on a piece of paper and be like, hey, here are all the like the weird things that you need to like learn, it would probably be pretty overwhelming. So
Nice. It's fascinating. This is the first time I've asked this question on a show, and it's really interesting to see how people approach it, especially like bubble developers like yourself who have been around the platform for a very long time. But yeah, great stuff. Okay, so I want to read you. This is going to be a hard pivot, but I want to read you a tweet that you wrote I think this was like a week ago or something. ChatGPT has already completely upended how I learn. Anytime I don't understand something, I start a conversation with it. I keep probing with follow-up questions until I understand. The implications for education are enormous. As an educator, as an entrepreneur, how are you thinking right now about advancements in AI in terms of not only how you're going to learn new stuff, but how you're going to teach your students?
Interesting. I'm so glad that you brought up AI because, like everybody else, is probably all
I know.
anyone wants to talk about at the
I feel
moment.
silly bringing it up because it's all I talk about, like anywhere, but I have to.
But it's so. I mean, it is. Yeah. Anyway, we'll go into it. I think it's it's a pretty revolutionary step in modern times, let's say. But yeah. So that tweet was essentially trying to capture the fact that like the way that we all been learning, let's just talk in a developer context because it's more specific. Like the way that we try to like learn how to do anything on our own is by doing Google searches, hoping that we find some Stack Overflow piece of code or description or some post on the forum or the right part of the API documentation or whatever. We're kind of surveying the field, collecting all these pieces of information, and then we're trying to synthesize it obviously in our minds and try to make sense of it and use that to solve whatever problem that we're facing. So there's all this time spent just like surveying and collating, and when you encounter something that like a new concept that you haven't had to understand before, then you've got to do a separate Google search for that. And then, I mean, this describes my experience so many times. If I don't have a deadline, if I have a deadline, then I'm just like scrapping. But if I don't have a deadline, then I'll go and start watching some YouTube videos about this concept that's still vague in my mind, like TCP or something is something that comes. And then I'll go down this rabbit hole of learning about that. And it might take me kind of completely off topic, but I'm trying to at the same time learn how to do something practical and learn all these different, build my my conceptual understanding of all of the pieces in this that are in this problem. But that's not the I think what many people would agree is the best way to learn would be, instead of doing all that surveying and trying to synthesize all that information, it would just to have like an expert who knows their stuff over your shoulder, who you can just ask questions to, who you're just like, hey, this is the problem. And they're like, okay, this is where I would recommend that you go. And and you start and you might tackle this part first. And then you're like, but that part includes this concept. Like I haven't worked with that before. Like, what is that? And then they would describe and give you an explanation of what is. Like, I'm in a co-working space here. It's not very populated. It's pretty scarce. But there's one guy who works closely to me, and he's a more traditional developer. And having worked in a remote context for so long, it's so refreshing to have somebody in real life who's right there, who I can just like, we can just talk about more general concepts and he can clarify some things and etc. And that's the same reason why recently I started working with a mentor who's a more traditional web developer who can help clarify some concepts. That was about 2 weeks before ChatGPT came out. And I find that I haven't really talked to him much since. And there's a reason. It's because ChatGPT is the most convenient way for me to emulate this expert over the shoulder conversation. And I think that's huge. That's just that alone is a massive deal, I think, in like the productivity of anybody in any area, but like, obviously developers who are working on a computer, who are interacting with digital tools, and so a digital assistant can like help them make sense of that. That's but in terms of the second part, like how it would impact how you teach, I don't know actually how it would affect the teaching side, because in some way the teaching side is now being outsourced. Even like in the Discord channel for the course, there's like people asking me questions, and I'm like giving them like a sort of my general answer, and then I'm like, but you should ask ChatGPT for the specifics.
Yeah. Do you foresee a time where someone could just learn Bubble completely if they wanted to by asking ChatGPT?
Yes, but not in its current form. I think it needs to have a visual layer to it. The day where and I'm sure this day is coming, the day where I could say, can you create like a step-by-step tutorial for me to create my Airbnb like marketplace, and do it in a really simplified way, like I'm learning this tool for the first time, and it generates like an interactive video tutorial for me that I can pause and I can even clarify at certain parts of the video. I mean that there's nothing that could possibly be better than that, because it's also real time. You're not like frustrating this educator who's just like sick of answering the same questions. But what's the end point to that, right? Because why can't it then just build the bloody app for you? Like, what's the role of the human in all of this is I think like the really interesting question. Like, where does this actually lead in terms of what productive workers are doing on a day-to-day basis when the AI knows how to do it all for you? Like, do they need the human as the vehicle to get it done? If it's digital work, I think there's a big question mark over that. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But
No, I'm worried about that too. Like, what does society look like when, I think even thinking about education in high school right now, or, there's already reports, and I imagine this was true before ChatGPT even, but just how easy ChatGPT is to use. I imagine, there are some kind of like some deep existential questions being asked about, why should we learn how to write an essay? Why should we teach our kids how to do this? Because this AI can do it just as well, if not better, in like no time at all. So there's some questions, I guess, about I guess you could say that the purpose of writing an essay, to go down this route in particular, and maybe the purpose of like learning Bubble, the purpose of learning anything, but in particular when you're growing up and going to high school and through university, is not necessarily about writing the best essay. It's about how to think about writing an essay, right? So you develop these skills of critical thinking, let's say. How do I think about an argument? How do I present my thoughts in a clear way? And humans, will still need to do that forever. I mean, it's always valuable to know how to think clearly. So I guess you could make that argument, but there's something depressing about, like, if I was a high school student, my teacher was like, can you go write this essay and compare these two things? And I knew that there was this tool out there that could do that way faster and better than I could at that moment. That would be a hard thing to swallow and to go do as a rebellious teenager, let's say.
Yeah, I I agree, but I actually think that points to a problem with the way that we're treating education, because what's the point in getting you in giving you an assignment like compare these two philosophies, or compare these two viewpoints, compare and contrast these two kind of viewpoints, like as a question, like a task to take on. Like what's the
I
point
would
of
say, if
doing
I were
that?
answering that question, the point is so that you can learn about, learn how to think about two opposing ideas and compare them. So like the practical, there are times in life where two things that are opposing are true, and it's helpful to be able to like kind of separate yourself and look at, like, make the best possible argument for one case, let's say like Steelman one side and then Steelman another side. If I were playing devil's advocate and answering your question, what do you think it is?
Well, I think you're spot on. Like it's about developing those skills in the student, but it doesn't have a purpose beyond that, right? It doesn't have like there's not an artifact at the end that you create beyond just the essay. But I think all students can see through that, where it's just like, okay, it's an essay, so that because that's what I just have to do at school, which is completely different than um, maybe writing an essay which is trying to say, like, what would Nietzsche say about uh, our um, our rapid uptake of artificial intelligence into our workflows or something. Like that's a question you could pop into ChatGPT, I think. And if you're not an interested student, then that's what you would do. But if it's a question that you're genuinely interested in, um, I don't think that ChatGPT would ever satisfy me. Like I think that's we want to think about problems like that. Not necessarily that problem, but everyone's got their own problems that they like to engage with. It's why we do crosswords and wordles and all that stuff. Like we enjoy that. There's something, from an evolutionary perspective, that's important for us to engage with problems like that on a recurring basis. And so I think from an educational point of view, um, if anything, ChatGPT is just going to like expose the futility of getting people to do assignments for the pure purpose of developing a mindset. I think it's the opposite way around. Like the mindset comes from trying to solve a problem that you actually care about. It's just along for the ride. We're pulling the cart
I
before the
I
horse,
I
I
just had
think.
this thought as you were speaking that maybe what will end up happening is that you'll end up getting graded on, like the prompts will become more important to think about for students, right? Like maybe the assignment is get chat gpt or whatever AI is we're working with at that time to produce some sort of creative essay, and what becomes more important are the inputs for the student. Like how do you ask the right questions, how do you get creative with them, and then the output to a point where like the output is actually interesting. Like I'd be fascinated to hear Nietzsche's take on how AI is going to impact us, even if it's completely artificially generated. That would be an interesting thing to read.
Right.
I
Or
could imagine, like,
yeah.
yeah,
Or like the assignment is to hand in your conversation,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like the conversation itself is in a way a piece of like an educational asset, let's say, or something like that. It's just in a different format, right? Like an interview with a band in a student magazine or something. They've got those like question answer formats. Yeah, that would be really cool. And then yeah, what you're developing there is um, the ability to ask good questions, which is again a product of like thinking clearly and mapping the problem out, in your mind. Yeah, it's gonna be so interesting to see how it all unfolds.
and again, as an educator and an entrepreneur in particular, let's say, when you think about your business, are you trying to think about how can I take advantage of this? Is it something that you think about a lot, or is it more like this stuff is all happening so fast? I'm just going to kind of wait to see what happens. And when something presents itself to me in terms of how I might be able to use this technology, I'll take advantage of it. How are you thinking about this shift?
Um, I mean, there's lots of ideas. There's lots of things I'd like to build. There's not enough hours in the day, and I'm having to actively restrain myself because the course was just like this monstrous effort this year. While I had a child at the same time, and we moved to the other side of the world, and it was just a very difficult to balance all those things. And so now I'm trying to like rebalance and resist the urge to get carried away with another project. But that doesn't. I mean, I've been dabbling, but with no pressure. Like I'm not like I need to turn this into a business or I need to get this out there before somebody else has the same idea. Because for me personally, that is like a bit of a psychological trap. So more just like
How
just
is it
sort
a
of having.
psychological trap?
I think that building some successful uh, app, innovative app where I'm learning a whole bunch of things along the way will bring me happiness, everlasting happiness, basically. Which of course it never does, and it comes at the expense of other parts of your life, like your family life and your social life, and just it takes up real estate in my brain. You know that ultimately, like if I'm not careful, becomes like an anxiety producing kind of part, because then there's like this like pressure to make it into something and for it to be probably generating some financial return to justify all the time that I'm spending on it. Um, yeah, but I am still looking from the context of the course, like because that's kind of more, that doesn't feel as much of like a hobby that I'm trying to turn into some productive pursuit. There's like obvious areas like generating subtitles and transcripts and stuff like that that I will definitely do. I just haven't got around to yet. Um,
Yeah, well, I was following your tweets and empathizing with them when you were recording the course, just about how difficult that is when you're recording a long course. Some of the silly things, like I watched your video when like the fire alarm was going off, or when you were filming, and knowing when to shave and change your clothes because you're filming videos back to back, and it might look weird if in the next lesson you look suddenly different to your students. So I could definitely I mean, the video creation part, once AI starts doing that and you don't have to like worry about filming anymore, that's a scary time. Maybe coming sooner than we think, but like definitely some of the boring stuff. Doing these podcasts, one of the things that is the most dry and boring and annoying to do every week is to build the YouTube like chapters so that you can like skip ahead in the video. And I found this one company called Assembly AI, which has this API you basically just like send the audio file to, and they do a whole bunch of things. They take the transcript out, and they say that they produce chapters. I was hopeful that it would do it perfectly. It wasn't even close in terms of how I would want chapters made, so we're still a little ways off, but this stuff is it really feels like this past year especially we've hit this kind of this exponential curve, or this part of the curve that feels like we're on the way up that roller coaster, going really quickly. So who knows how fast this stuff will all work out.
yeah, yeah. I must. So it wasn't very good the last time that you tried it, this tool at all, because I need to do something like that myself.
The transcript was okay, and then I think you could probably do more work yourself in terms of like having some sort of setup where you feed that transcript to OpenAI's. You could paste it into ChatGPT, but if you wanted to set the whole thing up programmatically, there's not, as far as I know, an API available right now for ChatGPT, but they have GPT-3, which is still decent. So I think you could probably do some work and get kind of far, but yeah, I haven't seen a perfect solution for it yet.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it probably requires a little bit of like tinkering with one of the existing models, and you have to like train it on a video where you feed it the chapters and
Yeah,
the
exactly.
transcript, which was
Input, output.
probably, yeah, exactly, which is probably like 3 hours away. Someone's working on it right now. We just don't know about it.
Yeah, someone has raised a bunch of capital and is pouring a bunch of resources into it for sure. Um, how did you get into or find this passion for education? Seems like you've had an interesting background. I think your background is in film. You found your story about how you found this space is fairly typical in the sense that you had this idea and were looking for ways to build it. At what point did you discover this passion for education?
Um, so it was around the time that I discovered Bubble. I think uh, like there's two parts to that. Like there's one part where like I sort of discovered I guess a passion or an ideology uh, around what's broken in mainstream education, and that was just after I like kind of like left university and I was was pursuing this idea of a peer-to-peer education system, which practically speaking, because I was really involved in the space at the time, was like this blockchain powered thing. Um, and that to me felt like, oh, that might be an antidote to like a lot of the problems that I feel are in education right now, which is basically, you can summarize as like an undue focus on credentials, and so like fulfilling requirements to get certificates and diplomas. And again, this is like the cart before the horse thing. Like the learning is secondary, and fulfilling the assignments is primary, and that has probably a lot of different implications. So there's that side of it, like education as a whole, as a domain, is just interesting to me, and like especially like how people are developing new like innovative models. Um, but then the other part of it um, is I guess like the teaching and the learning, because it's just, it goes, to me it goes hand in hand. Like I like to teach what I learn, and I don't like teaching so much stuff that, well, let's put it this way, like it's teaching something that I haven't seen described in a way that I would like it described is really interesting, because that's really about like, okay, how do you like break it down, simplify it? Like how would you explain it to a 5-year-old? Like that's kind of like the storytelling piece. That's just like that's an interesting exercise. And then yeah, I guess under that is like you always have an excuse to learn something new if you're teaching. And you always do learn when you're trying to teach something. You always learn more about what you're teaching, just in the process of breaking it down, because it reveals where you're weak in
Mm-hmm.
your understanding and where you need to kind of learn more.
Yeah, I noticed when I was preparing for this interview and watching your lessons and reading your blog, this thread of storytelling and this very visual way of that you have of communicating information. My favorite example was the story of the giraffe on your blog. How did giraffes and the way that they have evolved over time to have really long necks, how does that relate to tech debt? And actually, I think that's an interesting point and comparison that you make in and of itself. Could you tell us a little bit about how the long necks of giraffes relate to tech debt and development in Bubble really quickly?
Yeah, sure. So that story is it's based around the fact that giraffes, and I think it's all mammals, it's also humans, have this. I think it's the laryngeal nerve. I think from memory is how you pronounce it, and it goes from the I think it goes from the brain to the esophagus from memory, and it regulates some breathing. It's a nerve. I might have got that wrong, but basically it developed way back when we were amphibians, and when a genus, a branch forked off, this nerve was going around like the rib cage and lungs. And in mammals, there's the sort of the neck's lengthened, and that meant that this nerve had to take this kind of this longer path, like this detour, in order to still make that connection. And that's because it was, in fact, it was under the rib cage, so it had no choice but to keep going down as the neck and the whole sort of torso area got more elongated. Because of course in evolution you can't just like click a button and just say, oh, actually, like, undo. Let's just like reconnect. Like you're baked into a particular path. And so the lesson there for development is to be aware of how you're connecting things up in the early stages, that you're not sort of binding yourself into a corner that is going to be very difficult for you to untangle later on, where there might be a much simpler, shorter path for simpler way of doing something, but because you coupled all of this logic in with this other module that's then gone out in this whole nother direction, well, now you're having to jump through hoops just to keep the app functioning. Whereas if you could have some foresight in the beginning at how things might develop, and if you could keep things relatively modular, then you might be able to reconnect that much quicker, because that's the benefit that you have in development rather than evolution, is you can kind of go back in time, so to speak. But the big disclaimer there is that, you can't always do that. You don't want to get like wrapped up in a world of hypothetical scenarios that might come up and just spend all this time, extra effort, sort of building a robust foundation as opposed to just like getting the structure up. There's obviously a balance somewhere in there, but that's the basic takeaway.
Yeah, I love that, and I think that to your last point there, anyone who's worked on a team on an app knows that tension between, okay, where are we at right now? What feature do we want to build? Well, we can't build it this way because things were built previously in this other way that makes doing that complicated. And there's always this tension between, should we spend time cleaning this up so that it's more modular or scalable or whatever it is? Or should we just push forward and build on top of what we already have to optimize for speed? And I think I've heard stories, at least. I've never worked on like a startup that's been around and has this established tech stack that's 10 years old. But I've heard stories of people who are working inside of systems like that, where it seems like it does become like evolution in the sense that you can't undo it, or it's just like so far down a certain path that to undo it would be way, way more harm than it's worth. So, but yeah, going back to storytelling, I love the way that you present that idea in particular. Like, I think just as someone who was reading that, my curiosity was piqued. I was like, well, what is he talking about? How is a giraffe similar to tech debt? And as you're going through and making that analogy, it works so perfectly. And you've brought up storytelling many times in this interview already. What is it about storytelling what is it going on in the mind of humans, and what is it about human psychology that makes storytelling so particularly useful when we're trying to learn something?
Well, I don't know what it is about the minds of humans. I mean, it's probably something to do with, it's undoubtedly to do with the encoding of information, right? And there's a structure to the information where it's all linked that makes it easier to not just memorize in like a rote memorization kind of superficial way, but like to learn, to like for it to like, I guess, be uploaded to your subconscious in some way. So it's probably something to do with that. But the more direct, I guess, answer is that uh, like the giraffe analogy, like you can understand unfamiliar territory by mapping it to familiar territory. So by telling the story of a giraffe, like it almost gives a structure for understanding this more like abstract idea of technical debt. Um, there's Richard Feynman, the
I've heard of him.
American physicist.
I've heard the name, but I don't know anything about him.
You should look at some of his videos on YouTube. He's got like he does this series of he does this interview where the interviewer is asking him like how to describe certain things, like how fire works, or not fireworks like Guy Fawkes, but how does fire, mechanically speaking, work. And he has this great bit where he's talking about the interviewer is asking him how magnetism works, and Rich Feynman basically like breaks down where he's like, I could tell you that it kind of works like a rubber band, because of this blah 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 blah, but it's not really accurate. I'd really be doing you a disservice because the analogy breaks down in these kind of ways, and so I need to know what your pre-existing level of knowledge is in order to answer that question, because I need to explain it in terms that you're familiar with. And at the moment, I don't think magnetism is like anything that you're familiar with because it's such a weird concept. And so I think that's what he was getting at there, was like you almost need like an anchor to something that you do already understand. And for whatever reason, yeah, stories and analogies, which is, obviously just sort of a type of story, they provide that structure, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I noticed that too. Like even it doesn't have to be something as complicated as physics, but even my experience speaking with students who are learning Bubble, like once you start talking about data types or fields, it's like even that language, like no one knows what a type or a field is, but when you start making a comparison to like comments or posts, and like a post on a social network and how a comment is related to it, if you start framing it in that way that's much more familiar, explaining the concept of a relational database becomes much easier and seems to stick better.
Yeah, 100%. That's where I think a lot of like tutorial makers and educators in general go wrong, is they jump straight into trying to explain the relationships between these concepts, and they'll just introduce a concept and then another one, and then this is how they work, yeah, data types and fields or whatever. But what they don't realize, like in the mind of the student, and we've all been there, is like as soon as they introduce the first one, data type, like I just got hung up there. I was just like, wait, I don't what's that about? And then they start talking about this other thing and this other thing, but I'm still way over here, like lost in a whirlpool.
For sure. In a perfect world, if everything goes beautifully for the next 3 years, where do you see yourself working within this Bubble ecosystem that we're all a part of? Like what does your life look like professionally at that point?
I think I actually don't care too much about it being in Bubble. Like Bubble is like great. Bubble has shown what is possible when you can reduce the time between like an idea and its execution in the software sense, right? I just want to be working in product in some way, like in whether you call it like user experience design or product design, or just like right at that interface between like what users are wanting and the jobs that they need to be done, and like how do you translate that into an application, an experience basically that solves their problem. Like I sort of just want to go deeper into that world of things, because it just feels like where I'm drawn, and I don't know necessarily what that looks like, but what I have learned is I work better and enjoy work a lot more when I'm working with other people. So that's kind of a big piece of this, is like I don't want to be working on my own
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah. I can definitely relate to that. Okay, last question for you. It's a personal one too. You've mentioned that you recently had a kid. I want to have kids myself within the next, 2-3 years. How has having a kid changed your outlook, I guess, on your professional life? How has it changed you as a person? How has it changed you too as someone who has this entrepreneurial itch? How has it changed the way that you think about risk and pursuing business ideas? I know those are a bunch of different areas, but I'll just throw that question at you and see what you do with it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And what answer, as somebody who wants to have kids, like what answer do you want here?
I don't know. I
You can
don't.
have it all.
I don't think I'm looking for an answer. I think my interest is more just like I'm 32 right now, and a lot of my friends are starting to have kids, and I just like hearing the different ways that it changes them. So I don't think I'm particularly I'm hoping for an answer. More just like curious to see what's coming, I guess.
Well, it's definitely changed my appetite for risk. It's almost in some ways it's an easy question to answer, in some ways it's a hard question to answer because we had our son um, just before, oh, sorry, a little after I left my job at AirDev, where I was working full time, and that was like a secure thing, and I left there to pursue education related endeavors, which turned into this course, which I naively thought I could do very quickly, and then it would give me this nice passive income while the kid was here, so I could spend more time with the family and right. And suffice to say, it didn't turn out that way. It turned into this huge project that I had committed to that I had to balance alongside having this looking after our son. So it definitely like what I've learned is where the absolute limits to what I can do are. Like it's not sustainable to live in that way, and a renewed value for I guess life outside of work. Like there's when in some ways like people say having kids, it reminds you of what it's like to be a kid because they just pursue their curiosity and they're not encumbered by obligations and responsibilities and that kind of thing. But it sort of works. It's actually kind of the opposite because like the kid in you kind of has to suppress themselves. Like, I would love to just be going and spending all my day building AI tools. And I spent a lot of time over the past few years, like chasing white rabbits, like doing projects that I thought were like the perfect mesh of my innate curiosity. But because they weren't earning money, like they would always be corrupted by this idea of like, I've got to find a way to make it like financially sustainable. It would always suck all the fun out of it. And so definitely my appetite for like pursuing those kind of things that aren't going to like provide, very practically speaking, has just completely dropped off. But that might not be forever. Like I know there's a lot of fathers and mothers who do stuff in their free time when the kids are a bit older. It's right now he's still very young, so it's sort of hard to fit that stuff in. But I think to sum it up, like I've definitely got a renewed focus on stability and just slowing down. Technology is moving so fast. Like a bit of FOMO is inevitable. But this is sort of where I was also going with like where does it all end? Like it doesn't seem like it's going to end in ubiquitous human happiness. It's just more and more productivity and solving new problems that were created by the old technology and on and on and on it goes. So having a kid, I think, is reminded me to detach from that world a little bit. There's actually a great book I read recently, 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman, I think, and it's subtitles like Time Management for Mortals, and it's not like a very tactical like here's how to like do
Was
four
he?
hours.
I don't know if you. This is a silly question because I don't know if you listen to the other podcast, but I would guess maybe that you do. Do you know Sam Harris?
Yes,
Was
yeah,
he on his podcast? Like not so recently, but I think I remember listening to that episode, listening to an episode where someone was talking about time management in a way for mortals. And I would guess that it was probably him. It really, really resonated with me. Where it's like, stop
right.
trying to get it right because everyone fails at it. And he does present some practical tips. But anyways, I interrupted you. Please tell me what your impression of the book was.
No, yeah, like it was the perfect book to read at this phase of my life, like to really like remind oneself that there's only so many hours in a day, in a week. There's a finite amount of time. There's an infinite amount of possibilities, and the discomfort of not being able to meet all those possibilities is something that you have to learn how to live with. And obviously, like there's layers and layers to that, but that was the basic message that like I hadn't really internalized properly, I don't think, until then. So yeah, he was on Sam Harris's podcast. I don't know as an interview. I saw it as like he almost did like an audio version of the book because it's on the app, the Waking Up app. He's got like a full like it's like the audio version of the book but in short form. So I think it was a preview of one of those chapters.
Right. I remember that now. Yeah. Okay. That's so fascinating. One of the things that stuck out remembering to what it was like listening to that reading that he gave was that, and I've certainly been there myself, where you're kind of you're really motivated and you want to be hyper productive and you're trying to follow all of these productivity hacks. And his experience, I think, listening to him was that can become its own kind of anxiety about like, just how do I be productive as possible all the time? And I've certainly felt that myself. So it was refreshing to hear his take on it, which is that no one gets it right. You only have so much time. And how do we grapple with that reality, I guess?
Yeah, basically like, yeah, just drastically reduce your expectations and realize that all the hacks and stuff is ultimately because you're not accepting the fact that you're not going to get it all done. You're fooling yourself.
All right. Well, I mean, I think that, like I said, I wasn't hoping for any particular answer, but I liked your answer about having kids. It made me more excited, I would say. It tilted the needle towards more excited. I think those are all good things. So, Matt, I could talk to you for days, I think, but thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find you online?
Probably Twitter's the best place right now. Just for whatever reason, it seems like the most direct channel. So mneary0 is my handle. And I'm probably will post some more stuff to YouTube. It's just been untenable at the moment. Lowering expectations, right? So yeah, Twitter's the best place.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on. Thanks for watching, everyone. And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.